Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to our Bible class this morning. This is the last Sunday morning class of the year. This is the last class of this 6-month study. We're finishing up the book of Acts today, and it has been a rewarding study. I've enjoyed it so very much. We're going to begin our class with a prayer. Brother Matt Oglesby is going to lead us in that prayer.
Father in heaven, dear Lord, we're thankful this morning for the opportunity we have to study. We're thankful for your written word. We're thankful for the work of the Holy Spirit revealing that word to us. We pray, dear Lord, as we study that we will give your word the proper respect that it deserves, knowing that it comes from the Almighty Creator. We pray, dear Lord, that you will help us to have the right attitude with your word. We might be able to apply it in our lives. Better examples for the people around us. Dear Lord, continue to be with us and forgive us of our sins and bless us. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. We're looking at Acts chapter 27, Acts chapter 28 this morning as we conclude our study of the book of Acts. Not a lot of doctrinal material here. There are some doctrinal points that we could make from some of the things that are said, but primarily it's a history. It's a history of Paul's voyage from Caesarea Maritima to Rome. This was supposed to be a very short trip. Paul had planned to go to Rome. He'd mentioned that earlier in Acts chapter 19. He'd also mentioned that after he'd gone to Rome, he'd planned to go to Spain. There's no indication that he ever got to Spain. But he had planned to go to Rome, and he's going to get there, but probably not in the way that he thought he was going to get there. So he begins this voyage, and we begin our reading in chapter 27 and verse 1. It says, "And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustus regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail across the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Sicilia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy and put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days, we arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed. We sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia." So you see on the map here the voyage of Paul from Caesarea to Rome. And if you were to go in a straight line from Caesarea to Rome, you would travel 1,388 miles. Now, obviously, he's not going to travel in a straight line because you see all that wiggle down there that's going on. All of this in here, and what caused all of that in there? The weather. And Paul was concerned about the timing of the ship sailing. He voiced his opinion. He told them that it didn't look good and he didn't think they were going to make it, but nobody seemed to listen to him. And so as we think about this voyage, this is a voyage that should have taken 3 months. Tell us it took 9 months. It took a long time to get there. So there are a lot of problems that happened along the way. And there's some interesting things that happen along the way. We have an angel appearing to Paul. We have a message from God to Paul, from the angel, that the people of the ship are going to be saved, even though they are going to experience this horrible, horrible storm. So the journey begins here in verses 1 through 8. And then we begin in verse 9, and verses 9 through 12, we find that Paul warns about a disaster said here, And when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over. Okay, what's the fast? Anybody know? The fast is the Day of Atonement, and this is in late September. And Paul is smart enough to know that this is not a good time of the year to be sailing in the Mediterranean Sea. Winter is coming on. And so when you think about this voyage and all that they endured and going 14 days without eating, and you just see them fighting for their lives during this 2-week period of time, you can see them wet, you can see them exhausted, but also see them cold. And so this was a very difficult time for these folks as they tried to travel. Verse 9, and much time had been spent sailing and now dangerous because the fast was already over. Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end in disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives." Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman, or the captain of the ship, and the owner of the ship, than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, and by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor in Crete, opening toward the southwest and the northwest, and winter there. So Paul gives this warning that this is probably going to be a very dangerous trip, but he gets overruled. Who overrules him? The helmsman, or the captain, the guy in charge of the ship. Who else? Of that at this time, but he knew something about the time to sail. Yeah. So you've got the captain of the ship that says, yeah, we can make it. Who else says it? The owner of the ship. It's his ship, it's his laws. And who else? Okay. But who else advised that they go? The centurion. Who else? Verse 12. The majority. And the majority is always right, right? Well, no, and it didn't work out well this time either, because the majority was wrong, and Paul was right in this decision. Again, I think the question is good. Did Paul have any spiritual insight into this? There's no indication that he did. He's a fairly sharp guy. He knows this is the wrong time of the year to be sailing across the Mediterranean Sea, because this is a time of storms. So they had entered, in verse 6, this Alexandrian ship, and this Alexandrian ship is going to make its way to Rome. Where is Alexandria? Egypt. Why is there shipping between Egypt and Rome? A great deal of shipping between Egypt and Rome. What is this ship carrying? Wheat. The cargo is wheat. Egypt had always been known as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, because that Nile Delta is probably the richest place in the world as far as soil is concerned. And so this area is where this wheat was grown. How many crops of cotton do we get here in Alabama each year? Takes a long time, doesn't it? About 6 months or so, from April to September, whatever that is. When I was in Egypt, it was interesting that one of the people that was working with us said, we get 2 crops of cotton each year in Egypt, and sometimes 3. Now, how's that possible? Boy, you're looking at me like that's not real. How could that happen? Warmer weather. You didn't have cold weather to contend with. You had some of the richest soil in the world, and the Nile Delta was irrigated. You had water. And so this was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, and they're carrying wheat. We know that because later on, they decide they're going to have to do something about that. How many people's on the ship, by the way? Does anybody remember? 276, pretty good sized boat, isn't it? You got almost 300 people on here, and then you've got this cargo. The ship is really loaded down. And so it is an Alexandrian ship. Again, the waters were constantly plied between Rome and Alexandria, or Rome and Egypt, Italy and Egypt, because of the bread that the Roman Empire received, the wheat that the Roman Empire received from Egypt. So they decided to set sail. Paul wasn't for it, but he got outvoted, and he warned about the disaster. And then beginning in verse 13, we find that things go south real quickly. We probably won't read all of this, but I think it's interesting to note what is said here. Verse 13, the south wind blew softly. Now, that's nice, I guess, isn't it? Well, not really, because they're not going anywhere. Soft wind does not drive a ship, okay? Verse 14 says, but not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. Now, Euroclydon is a pretty serious situation. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive, or we let her be driven. What do you mean by that? Yeah, we weren't in control anymore. The wind was in control. And I've heard people describe this particular storm as a hurricane at sea. Now, y'all know something about hurricanes, don't you? More than you want to know, having had your house blown away 2 days before Christmas, I guess. Yeah. A few years ago. Huh? Yeah. So and those terms are used interchangeably. You're right, Ed. But this was a tremendous wind. But, you know, when we have a hurricane, it's usually gone in a few minutes or hours, isn't it? Evidently, this continued on and on and on and on and on, at least for 2 weeks. So can you imagine now being on a ship, this wooden ship in the middle of the ocean, Mediterranean Sea? You won't see land in any direction. The waves are horrible. The wind is blowing. I'm sure it's raining. You're wet, you're cold, you're hungry, and you begin to question whether or not you're going to live through all this. And that was the situation that they found themselves in.
I don't think they would have lived through it.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't think they would have lived through it.
That God had plans for Paul. Yeah, okay. Somebody else? Doris? Okay, that's another point. Yeah. So this had to be a horrible situation to live through. But this wind is driving them. It's pushing around. In verse 12, it said they had favorable winds, but then this tempest starts in verse 14, and we continue reading about it on through verse 20. So it's a difficult time for them. Verse 18 says, and because we were exceedingly tempest tossed. What does that mean? There's some pretty bad waves. Several years ago, a friend of mine took me out in his boat. We were in Shoal Creek and fishing, and he said, well, let's ride down to the lake. We went down to the lake, and as soon as we left Shoal Creek into the lake, the waves were about 5 or 6 feet, and I was scared to death. I couldn't wait to get back in Shoal Creek. Now, that's a 5 or 6 foot wave. Can you imagine a 20 or 30 foot wave? I think he said you weren't real smart, Mike. Oh, there's 2 sides to every story. But anyway, when you think about that, we can't imagine it because we've never been there. We can think about it and try to get an idea of what it's like. We really can't comprehend. Really thinking that death is a moment away constantly, hour after hour, day after day, night after night, on and on and on. It's not a good place to be. And so they're having a very difficult time with this tempest. And so in verse 18, they said they needed to lighten the ship. Now, why do you lighten the ship? Well, he said we lighten the ship because we were tempest tossed. So what does lightening the ship have to do with being tempest tossed? Ride the waves better. The less weight, probably the higher the ship would set in the water. I would think. So we're gonna lighten the weight, and we do that in verse 19 by throwing the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. This would include a number of things that would be very heavy. You would have all your turnbuckles and your hoists and your ropes and perhaps extra sail masts, perhaps extra sails. All of these add weight to the ship, and so they decide to discard them. That still doesn't solve the problem, and so then they decide to do what later on? They've done all that. What else are they going to do? They're going to throw the wheat overboard. Now, I imagine a boatload of wheat would be very, very heavy. And so at this point, the owner of the vessel, who's sailing on the vessel, decides to take the economic loss. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get to Rome, sell their wheat, make their money, and get back home. And now they're going to lose everything. They're even going to lose the ship. And so it's a very difficult time for them. And it's during this time, verse 21 says, but after long abstinence from food, when Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me. Yeah, they should have. And have not sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. Paul says, I told you so. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. So how does he know that there's not going to be any loss of life? An angel appears to him. That's what we read next. For there stood by me this angel of light, this angel of God, the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. So Paul says, I have it from God that we're going to be safe. God's guaranteed our safety. He's not going to make it any easier. It's going to get worse and worse. But he is going to save their lives. And so this horrible tempest shows up here, and that's during this period of time when the let's see, all of this in here. And that's just something that man came up with to show you that they didn't make it over to Syracuse like they'd planned to. It didn't happen quite the way they had planned. Any questions or comments?
It said they had not eaten, but evidently they're staying on board because it hasn't been eaten later, so I'm assuming all of them.
Right. And that's a possibility too. Not only all these other problems, but they may have been very sick. Anybody ever been seasick? It's not a good feeling, is it? Ken, I took some medicine to keep from being seasick, didn't I? And what did it do to me? It made me very sick. I ended up in the hospital the next day. I went out with Ken out in the ocean, and I put those patches on to keep me from getting seasick. And that night I slept with them. And during the middle of the night, I started falling and stumbling. I thought I was having a stroke. I didn't know what had happened. So, yeah, your brain can get really messed up in situations like this. But anyway, safety is guaranteed. Verse 26, however, we must run aground on a certain island. Okay, what island is that they're going to run aground on? Malta. Okay, Malta. And that's chapter 28, verse 1. We know that for sure. Okay, so for 14 nights, they were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea, and the Adriatic Sea would extend there between Macedonia and Italy and come on down into the Mediterranean Sea. We can see that. And the sailors thought, well, we're getting near the land. Is that a good thing? Yes. Is that a good thing? No. That's a yes and no thing. What's good about it? We get off a ship. What's bad about it? Well, we're probably going to hit something. And we're going to be thrown into the sea, and we're all going to perish. So there's two different thoughts there. Verse 28 says they took a sounding. I don't know how you take a sounding. Huh? Should. Yeah, but that doesn't sound like sounding to me. That's what I thought. But it doesn't sound like sounding. So I don't know. But anyway, it was 20 fathoms. What's a fathom? 6 feet. So it's 120 feet deep. That's not real deep for being out in the ocean, right? So, and then they went a little further and they took another sounding, and it was 15 feet or 90 feet. So evidently we're getting closer to land, and it looks like we're gonna either be saved or saturated or both. And verse 29 says, then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Now, keep in mind now, it's at night. We're in the middle of a storm. There's waves everywhere. We're all wet. We're cold. We're hungry. And we can't see. It's not a good situation. So they dropped these 4 anchors and prayed for day to come. Now, what's the purpose of an anchor? Keep you in a place. That's right. Okay. All right. Now, if I had time, I have 2 sermons from this verse. One is called The Christian's Hope, and the other is called 4 Anchors for the Christian. So, not going to spend any time on those. We don't have time to look at them. But this anchor is a heavy object that's let down from the ship by a rope to the ocean floor to hold the ship in place. And do we need anchors for the soul? What does the Bible tell us is an anchor of the soul? This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil. So hope is the anchor of the soul. So what does this hope do? What does this anchor do? Well, I suggest it stabilizes us just as it stabilizes the ship. And there are a number of verses we could look at, but I think of 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Why? We have this hope. And then the anchor roots us or grounds us, and those are terms that we find in the Bible, Ephesians 3:17, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you being rooted and grounded in love, and so forth. Now, Ed, did you say the word of God? Thank you. Because in my sermon on the four anchors, let me get the right number of anchors. First thing I mentioned is the word of God, the Bible. the Bible is something that helps to ground the child of God. That's something we can lean on, depend on, and have to help us to get to heaven. Anybody want to guess what the other three things were in my 4 anchor sermon? First one was the Bible. Number 2, the home. Number 3, prayer. And number 4, the church. All of these are anchors that help us, that help hold us in place, to keep our faith intact during the storms of life. And so there are a number of applications that we can make about this, but we obviously don't have time to do that. Okay. So they prayed for day to come, and day comes, and anyway, drop down to verse 34. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when they had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And all there were 276 persons on board the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So this voyage is an economic disaster. Not only do they lose the cargo, but they lose the ship. And so they didn't recognize the land, verse 39. They didn't know where they were, but there was a bay there and there was a beach there, and they made it to shore. And verse 41 says, but striking a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So again, keep it, horrible waves, just pounding them constantly. And this is going on and on and on. So the soldiers think, well, the prisoners are going to leave, they're going to escape, so what do we need to do? We need to kill them. Yeah, so verse 42, they decided that's what they needed to do. But anyway, those who could swim should jump overboard, verse 43, and get to land, and the rest on boards and some of the parts of the ships. And so it was that they all escaped to land. So they made it to this island. And let me get down here to the other map, and you see Malta down there below Sicily. Malta's just a real little area. I think it's 150 square miles, just a real small island. What a blessing that in this whole ocean they end up on this land. Not only do they end up on this land, but they end up in a situation where the people take good care of them. So in chapter 28, verse 2, the natives showed us unusual kindness, and somewhere along the way they were building a fire, I'm sure, to warm themselves. This is probably right after they got there. They're trying to build this fire. Paul's gathering firewood, and what happens to it? Snake bite. What kind of snake? A viper. Poisonous snake. So when the people who lived on Malta saw this, what did they conclude? He must have been a murderer, and he's made it this far, but hey, things work out. This guy's going to die. But he doesn't die. He just shakes it off, and he's fine. And certainly that had to get their attention. And so then we find that the leading citizen there was verse 7, was a man by the name of Publius, and his father, verse 8, was sick of fever and dysentery, and Paul went in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. Do you think this got the attention of the people on the island? Absolutely. So what happens at this point? Everybody that was sick came to see Paul. Paul healed all of them. And so this was a bad situation, but it was made better by the people on the island who seemed to take good care of them. And they stayed there 3 months. Verse 11, after 3 months, we sailed in an Alexandrian ship, another Alexandrian ship, and they landed at Syracuse. So if you look at the map there, you see where they sailed from Malta to Syracuse. So now they're getting to Sicily. They're almost to Italy now. And he says, we stayed 3 days and we circled around to reach Rhegium. And I think he meant they circled around the island of Sicily to reach Rhegium. And after one day, the south wind blew, and the next day we came to Putilio. I looked that up so I'd know how to say it, Putilio. And so now they are in Italy when they reach Putilio. So they're getting there. And from there, the brethren heard about us, and they came to meet us as far as Appia Forum in 3 Inns. And so you see that as you get closer to Rome, this road, that when they get to Putilio, they're on land. They're not on ship anymore. So now they're making it from there to Rome. And they're traveling up this road called the Appian Way. That road is still in existence today. The Romans were good road builders. I'll show you that in a minute. But as they're traveling toward Rome, there are brethren in Rome that hear that Paul's coming. And so as Paul is traveling north, these brethren start traveling south. And they came as far as Appia Forum, or the 3 Inns, and met him there, and he took courage, the Bible tells us. And so this was a great period of time for them. Verse 15, Paul saw them, he thanked God, and took courage. And then verse 16, and when we came to Rome. So now he's gotten to Rome. So make it from Malta all the way up here. We got that shipwreck, the natives showing kindness, healing people, his fathers and others. Paul continues on to Rome. And I thought I'd share with you some photographs of the Appian Way. The Romans were great builders. This road is 2,000 years old and still traveling. And they had great engineers, by the way. And here's an example of how they built those roads. They would dig down till they found a solid base, and then they would build it up and build it up and build it up. And they would build it in such a way that the road would last. You probably heard that all roads lead to Rome. I think all roads lead from Rome. And why did roads lead from Rome? Why did they build these roads? That's not why they built it. Why did they build it? For the army. So that they could send troops everywhere into the empire. And so that was the reason for that, Ron. And I was going to mention that. Thank you, Doris. In the 1950s, we came up with this interstate system. And why is our interstate system built with the specifications that it's built by? For the Army. To move troops, to move material, and to move tanks. Every time you go under an underpass, keep in mind that you're low enough down that a tank sitting on a truck can go under there. And so that's why the interstate system was built. Thank you, Ron. Okay. So there in Rome, verse 11, verse 16 in particular, when we came to Rome. So we get to Rome, and Paul is guarded there. He calls the leaders of the Jews together, and he doesn't seem to have much success with them. It says some of them believed. And so he's in this place there, and that's the end, and that's my alarm to tell me to stop at 5 after. Boy, that was just right, wasn't it? So I got 10 minutes. Now, why did I want to stop here? Well, you can read the rest of the verses here, but this is one of those books that stops like that. It just stops abruptly, and we're not told anything else. And so what I wanted to do is say, well, is there additional information about Paul in Rome? What else do we know about Paul in Rome, other than what Luke has written here for us? Well, we know he preached salvation in Caesar's household. And if we go back and look at some of these passages, it's interesting where he talks about that, particularly Philippians 4, verse 22, all the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household. Here's a man who's imprisoned, and he's teaching those who imprisoned him. Wow. And so we know he's busy teaching, and he has a hope for deliverance. Now, this is going to get into a situation where I didn't plan to get into until 2 days ago, but after I continued reading, my mind began to change, and I came to the conclusion that Paul was released from prison in Rome, just like the scholars say that he was. I found out that those smart people were probably smarter than me, because I'd always thought, when you get to Acts chapter 26, it is the end. That's it. Paul's ready to go. He's ready to die. But I don't think so after going back and studying this, because he plans to be delivered. And there are a number of passages that point this out. Philippians 2:24, but I trust in the Lord shall also come to you shortly. Philemon 22, he writes to Philemon, and he says, meanwhile also prepare a guest room for me, for I trust that through your prayers I will be granted to me. So he's making all these plans to leave. So trying to put this in a time frame, we find that he gets to Rome in 60. He's in prison from 60 to 62. Evidently in 62, he's released for 2 years, from 62 to 64. In 64, he's rearrested, brought back to Rome, and executed. Did I just dream all that up? Well, there's some reasons for that. I mean, this is something that never crossed my mind. I'd heard the first imprisonment, second imprisonment, but I never paid any attention to it. When we get to 2 Timothy, he's resigned to death. But now let's go back to this. He wrote these books, the prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. What about 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus? When did he write them? Those were the last books. This was later. And most of the biblical scholars will tell you that these books were written in the first imprisonment. The others were written in the second imprisonment. So what about the writing 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus? Did Paul serve 2 imprisonments in Rome? Some writings suggest that. Many scholars believe Paul was in prison for 2 years, then released. This is interesting. One of the latter books, Titus 3, verse 12, when I sent Artemas to you, or Tychicus, be diligent to come to me at Nicopolis. Well, wait a minute. I thought he was in Rome in prison. This is 4 years after he's been in prison, 60. But where is he now? He's in Nicopolis. And Nicopolis is on the western shore of Greece on the Adriatic Sea. I've decided to winter there. I'm going to spend the winter here. And many scholars think this is where he was arrested again the second time. 2 Timothy 4:20, Erastus stayed in Corinth, but Trophimus I've left in Miletus sick. What are you doing in Miletus, Paul? I thought you were in prison in Rome. Evidently, he's been released. He's gone to Miletus. He's left Trophimus there sick. So these are the later books. These are books that are written 2 to 3 years after Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And that brings us back to where we started. We began by saying Acts was 30 years that changed the world. And certainly it was. And again, the message from the Lord, the Great Commission, was go into all the world, go therefore make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And that's what we find in the book of Acts. So we go back and look at this book. We start off in Acts chapter 1 with Jesus still on the earth. But what happens in chapter 1? He ascends into heaven. What happens in Acts chapter 2? The establishment of the church. And so from Acts chapter 2 going forward, we find the spread of the gospel. And how was that gospel to spread according to verse 8? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. And that's what the book of Acts is all about. The spreading of the gospel from Jerusalem to the uttermost parts of the world. Done primarily, according to this book, by the work of the Apostle Paul and the 3 missionary journeys that he made. And we spent a lot of our time talking about these journeys. And then making his way back to Jerusalem, he was arrested. We made the statement earlier that about a third of the book of Acts deals with Paul's in prison. And that goes from chapter 20 through chapter 28. Okay, any questions or comments from anyone? What? The spreading flame. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, you'd think he would be preaching there as well, wouldn't he? If he was staying there during that period of time. I'm sure he found that interesting when she did it. Okay. Well, I've enjoyed the study. I appreciate the work of David. The first 3 months and the first half of this book, he did an excellent job. And I tell you, it's been many, many years since I've studied the book of Acts. And I guess maybe we don't study the book of Acts because we all feel like we know the book of Acts. We've been through it. We understand. It's just a matter of history. But I hope that we've shared some things that maybe you hadn't thought about over the past 6-month period. Thank you.